I never imagined cleaning up after the dinner rush could feel more intimate than a candlelit date. Past midnight, the high-end restaurant kitchen was finally quiet. Just me and my head chef, Mark, surrounded by gleaming steel counters and the lingering aroma of garlic and seared steak. My heart thumped hard against my ribs, and I tried to blame it on the adrenaline of a busy night. In truth, it beat even faster whenever Mark glanced my way. He stood a few feet from me, rolling up his sleeves as we tackled the last of the cleanup. Normally, Mark was all sharp commands and intense focus, especially during dinner service. But now his voice was softer in the quiet. "You did well tonight," he said, breaking the silence. Even with that little scallop scare, I felt my cheeks warm at the teasing note in his voice. During the rush, I had nearly overcooked a scallop dish, my one slip in an otherwise smooth night. Mark had jumped in behind me, his strong hands briefly guiding mine on the pan to save the dish in time. The memory of his chest pressed against my back still made my pulse flutter. "Thanks," I mumbled, scrubbing at a stain on the counter. "And sorry again. I swear I triple-checked the timer." "We all make mistakes," he said gently, wiping down the station beside me. Hearing such patience from him was unexpected. I risked a look at Mark's face. His dark eyes were usually so stern, but right now they held a warmth that made my breath catch. An awkward silence settled as I searched for something to say. The hum of the refrigerator and the drip of a faucet filled the space as we worked. Every movement between us felt charged. When I reached over to toss a wet rag in the sink, my shoulder lightly brushed against his arm. I tensed, shooting him a quick look. He froze for a second too, meeting my eyes as if he felt it, the spark of that tiny touch, just as acutely as I did. I quickly stepped aside, my heart pounding. "Sorry," I stammered. Mark cleared his throat. "It's okay." His lips curved in a faint smile, and I realized he was standing closer than before. "Long night, huh?" I nodded, swallowing hard. "Yeah, but I'm glad we got through it." I tried to sound casual, but my voice was hushed. Being alone with him like this was nerve-wracking in a way the hectic dinner rush never was. He ran a hand through his short, dark hair, messing it up in a boyish way that contrasted with the authoritative chef I'd seen all evening. "Thanks for staying to help. You really didn't have to." A small smile found its way to my face. "I wanted to. Besides, I don't mind the quiet after everyone leaves. It's kind of nice." I trailed off as Mark took a slow step nearer. The air seemed to thicken between us. Suddenly, my sneaker slid on a patch of wet tile that I'd missed while mopping. With a yelp, I felt myself going down. In an instant, Mark lunged forward and caught me. One strong arm wrapped around my waist, the other hand grasping my forearm firmly. My breath hitched as I found myself pulled against his chest. For a moment, neither of us moved. My palms were flat against his chest, the soft cotton of his chef's jacket beneath my fingers and the solid muscle underneath. I was enveloped in the warmth of him and the scent of soap, spices, and a hint of his cologne. It was intoxicating. "Careful," he said in a low, strained voice. "Are you okay?" I managed a shaky nod, but I didn't step out of his arms, and he didn't let go. Mark's face was inches from mine now. I could see a tiny scar near his jawline, the flecks of gold in his brown eyes, the way his gaze flicked down to my lips when I nervously wet them with my tongue. My heart was thundering so loudly I was sure he could feel it. "This is it," I thought, wildly. "This is the moment everything changes." I knew I should back away, crack a joke, do anything to break the spell, but I remained captive in his arms, my body betraying me as it leaned subtly closer. "Zoe," Mark murmured, my name coming out like a gentle plea. His hand at my waist tightened just a fraction, drawing me even nearer. My blood roared in my ears. Was this really happening? I tilted my face up, eyes locked with his. "Mark, I began, not even sure what I was going to say. I just knew I had to say something before I lost myself completely. Before either of us could utter another word, the creak of the swinging kitchen door sliced through the haze between us. We jumped apart as if lightning had struck. Mark's arms fell away just as a third figure stepped into the kitchen. My stomach plunged to the floor. Aiden, one of the restaurant owners, stood in the doorway, eyebrows raised at the sight of us. His gaze flickered from me to Mark and back, taking in our flushed faces and the charged air we couldn't quite hide. For a heartbeat, the three of us were frozen in place. I felt heat rush to my face, panic and embarrassment twisting in my gut. How much had Aiden seen? Am I interrupting something? Aiden asked slowly, breaking the silence. I opened my mouth, but no sound came out. Mark straightened up, quickly putting a safe distance between us, his expression shifting back to neutral. My mind raced, grasping for any innocent explanation, but nothing came. My heart hammered as I realized the precarious line Mark and I had been balancing on was now fully exposed. The secret longing that moments ago felt so private was now hanging, in the air, visible to someone who very much shouldn't be witnessing this. I stood there speechless, a million thoughts swirling in my head and not a single one I could say. This night, this forbidden moment, had just taken a turn I never expected. And whatever happened next, one thing was certain. Nothing in this workplace would ever be the same. Aiden lingered in the doorway just long enough to make the tension unbearable. His sharp eyes moved between me and Mark, and for a terrifying second, I thought he might actually say something about what he'd seen. Instead, he let out a short breath and shook his head. "You guys are still here? Thought everyone had left. Hours ago." Mark cleared his throat, his voice carefully neutral. "Yeah, just finishing up." His back was turned to me now, shoulders tense as he wiped down a counter that was already spotless. "Well, lock up when you're done," Aiden said flatly, then disappeared back into the hallway. The door swung shut behind him, leaving us alone once again. I stood frozen, barely able to breathe. The warmth of Mark's arms still clung to my skin. Yet now it felt like a dangerous memory, something I couldn't let happen again. I knew what people would assume if they saw us together like that. Worse, I knew what Aiden might say to the other managers. Rumors spread like wildfire in this place, and the last thing I needed was for whispers about Mark and me to reach the wrong ears. "I should go," I blurted, grabbing my jacket off the hook near the door. My voice came out too sharp, too sudden. Mark finally turned to face me, his eyes clouded with something unreadable. "Zoe." He started to say something else, but his words trailed off. Whatever he'd been about to say, he swallowed it back. "Get home safe. You too," I muttered, practically bolting through the door. I spent the weekend avoiding Mark altogether, though it wasn't easy. The restaurant had been slammed, and every time I caught a glimpse of him across the room, my stomach twisted into a knot. He never looked my way, but I knew he felt it too. The weight of what almost happened. By Monday, I convinced myself it had all been a mistake, one fleeting moment of weakness. I told myself I could pretend it never happened. But that resolve crumbled the moment I walked into the staff room at the start of my shift. Mark was there, alone, leaning against the counter with his phone in hand. He glanced up as I entered, his gaze locking onto mine. "Hey," he said quietly. "Hey," I replied, my pulse already quickening. I should have turned around and left, but instead I lingered by my locker, fumbling with my apron strings to give myself something to do. "About the other night," Mark started, his voice low and uncertain. I froze. "We shouldn't talk about it," I cut in quickly. "It's fine. It didn't mean anything." "Didn't it?" His voice was softer now, almost hurt. I forced myself to keep my eyes on my locker door, pretending I was too busy to look at him. "It can't," I said firmly. "We work together. And Aiden..." I shook my head. "It's just messy." Mark sighed, pushing himself off the counter. "Yeah," he murmured. "Messy." His tone was bitter, and before I could think of anything else to say, he walked past me and out the door. I stood there for a long time, my chest tight. I'd done the right thing. I was sure of it. So why did it feel like I'd just lost something I hadn't even realized I wanted? Lying that night, I was cleaning up near the wine rack when I heard footsteps behind me. I turned to see Mark standing there, his face unreadable. "I know you said it doesn't mean anything," he said quietly. "But you felt it too." I opened my mouth to deny it, but the words caught in my throat. Because he was right. I had felt it. That electric pull, the way his touch had lingered on my skin. And now, here he was again, standing too close and staring at me like he knew, every thought racing through my mind. "Mark," I started, but this time he stepped closer, cutting me off. "I don't care what anyone thinks," he said, his voice low and firm. "I'm not pretending this didn't happen." My breath hitched. "We can't." "Then tell me you don't want this," he challenged. "Look me in the eye and say it." I couldn't. Because the truth was, I wanted him more than I'd ever wanted anything. And standing there in that dimly lit corner of the restaurant, with Mark so close I could feel the heat of him, I knew I was dangerously close to crossing a line I could never step back from. In the next few days were torture. We kept our distance, but the tension only grew worse. Every glance across the kitchen lingered a second too long, and my mind kept replaying that night by the wine rack. I knew I should let it go, push him out of my head, but I couldn't. Then, one evening just after closing, I found myself alone with Mark again. The restaurant was dark except for the low glow of the emergency lights, and the air felt thick with everything unsaid. "You're still here?" Mark asked, stepping into the doorway. His voice was quiet, but I could hear the tension underneath. "I was just finishing up," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. He leaned against the doorframe, watching me. "I can't stop thinking about you," he admitted. "And I'm done pretending I can." I swallowed hard, my fingers gripping the rag I'd been using to clean. "Mark, you can't." "I know," he said, but he didn't move away. Instead, he stepped forward, closing the distance between us. "But I don't care anymore." He was standing, right in front of me now, his hand reaching up to tuck a stray lock of hair behind my ear. My breath caught. Every nerve in my body screamed at me to step away. But I couldn't. I didn't want to. "Tell me you don't feel this," he murmured, his fingers tracing down my arm. "I can't," I whispered, "because I do." In that moment, I knew I was crossing the line, and yet, as his hand slid down to my waist, pulling me closer, I knew I wasn't going to stop. The sound of a glass shattering broke the silence. I jumped back just as Aiden's voice rang out from the doorway. "Seriously?" Aiden scoffed, stepping into the room. "You think no one's noticed?" My heart pounded. Mark straightened beside me, his jaw tight. "This isn't your business," Mark said coldly. "It is when you're sneaking around in my restaurant," Aiden shot back. "You know the rules. One mistake, and you're both out." I swallowed hard. "Please, don't do this," I said quietly. Aiden's gaze shifted to me, his expression softening slightly. "Look, I get it, but you both know this won't end well." Mark's hand found mine, fingers lacing tightly with mine. "We'll figure it out," he said firmly. Aiden sighed and turned away, muttering as he walked off. Just be careful. I stood there, my fingers still tangled with marks. Whatever came next, we'd face it together.